Good morning, I'm Tamara Shoemaker. It wasn't until my kids were out of the crib and into their twin beds that I first heard about how dangerous drop-side cribs were. We had a drop-side crib. It had been given to us when my first child came along. We kept it through all three of our kids. Per the name, a drop-side crib is one where one side of the crib releases and it drops down to nearly level with the mattress, sort of like a vertical sliding minivan door, right? And it was super handy for picking up a squalling, hungry baby, but it was also fairly dangerous, enough that the manufacturer stopped making them. And apparently toddlers would release the mechanism and could seriously hurt themselves as the side dropped down without adult assistance, so they stopped making them. But our drop side mechanism got permanently stuck somewhere in my first child's time as a toddler, so we never used it. But my kids, when they got big enough, instead of me coming in and picking them up out of the side, they would cry out to be released from the crib because it was tall again. And I would hear them get up from their nap, and soon afterwards their insistent wail would come through the monitor, and the wail would just, let me know, I want out, let me out. So when I'd open the bedroom door, the wail would stop abruptly and a grin would break out over the face that was barely visible above the top of the rail, and arms would go up high above the toddler's head and palms would spread wide. Pick me up, get me out of here. So I'd go over to the crib and I'd slide my hands around their tiny little rib cages and I'd pull them out. And there's this handy dandy little niche that's perfect for lifting up the sad child. It only works when their arms are up, and it's called the armpit. When you slide your hands just below their armpits, their appendages come down and they hook in with certainty and security, and you've got this insta-leverage, right, to lift your child to freedom. So why am I talking about armpits when we're supposed to be in Esther? I'll explain. Esther 3, it introduces us to the resident villain number 1 in the house of King Xerxes. I did mention him in yesterday's blog post. But anyway, his name is Haman. He's the son of a man named Hammedatha, who significantly for my point is an Agagite. And you're going to have to excuse my pronunciation. I don't know how to pronounce half of these, but he's an Agagite. What in the world is an Agagite? An Agagite very likely refers to descendant of Agag. Who is Agag? So if we look back at 1 Samuel chapter 15, I'll summarize what happens in it. Saul, king of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, that's important too, remember that, he goes out per the Lord's command to fight the Amalekites. The Lord gives instructions through his prophet Samuel for this particular battle. Samuel tells Saul, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt." And we'll get there in just a second. So now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. 1 Samuel 15, 2-3. Have you ever had thistles crop up in your yard? It's so frustrating because when I first discovered one near the road on our property several years ago, I just mowed over it. I figured it would eventually go away, right? Which shows how much I knew about the nature of weeds. But it didn't, obviously. I cropped the top, yeah, so you couldn't see it anymore, but all it did was spray those weed seeds all through my lawnmower into my grass, all over the place. And ever since then, even years later, we fight the battle of the thistles. Every time that we see a thistle, we have to stop the mower, grab our spade, root it out completely to keep it from spreading even more. War isn't pretty, and annihilation is awful. But God commanded a complete rooting out of this thistle in the side of his chosen people. The Amalekites were determined to completely destroy Israel. God said no, and he commanded Saul through Samuel to completely destroy the nation of Amalek. So what does Saul do? Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur to the east of Egypt. He took Agag, remember him, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all the people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. 1 Samuel 15, 7-9. In other words, Saul only cropped the top of the thistle, right? The nation. And God wasn't happy about it. In 1 Samuel 15:11 it says, "Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." Okay, But to understand what happens in Esther 3, we've got to go back even further to the reason that the Lord told Saul to wipe out Agag's people in the first place. Check out Exodus 17:8. The Amalekites, I can't say that word, came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. This is the battle Samuel reminded Saul of when he told him to go wipe out Agag and the Amalekites. So Joshua, who is Moses' military commander, fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up on top of the hill over here. As long as Moses held up his hands high up, the Israelites were winning, but whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until sunset. That was Exodus 17:10-12. Hands up, pick me up, get me out of here. So in Exodus 17:13, it says, so Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Okay. Now let's get to Esther 3 to set the scene. It says, after these events, the assassination plot that I talked about yesterday, where Mordecai foiled what he overheard from Teresh and Bigthana, I believe. King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. That's from Esther 3:1-2. So immediately in this chapter, we have two nations juxtaposed against each other. The Amalekite ancestry, descendant of Agag, and the Jewish ancestry, descendant of Benjamin. Saul was a Benjamite, remember? And boy, are there some weighty pickles to fry here. So then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. That's Esther 3:3-6. You can almost hear the bell for the round to start, right? In a boxing match. Jews over here, Amalekites over here, and the audience is pitting them against each other and egging them on. These guys despised each other. Mordecai likely for the reasons of Haman's ancestry, and Haman the same, with the additional factor that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him, right? And Haman, to his discredit, isn't content with only taking vengeance on the guy who's standing up to him. He decides that anyone associated or connected to Mordecai has to die as well. Mordecai's refusal to bow isn't likely stemming from the adherence to the second commandment, right? Because throughout Old Testament history, there are multiple mentions of Jewish people who are faithful to God, bowing and prostrating themselves to others as a sign of respect. 1 Samuel 24:8 is one instance. They don't worship the ones to whom they're bowing, but it was a cultural way of showing submission and reverence. But Mordecai's refusal to show Haman the same reverence got his goat. He hated him. So Haman buddies up with his, astrologer advisor people, probably the same ones, maybe the same ones who advised the king, maybe not, maybe there were different ones. But they all came to a consensus, total and absolute destruction of the Jews. But they needed to have a time frame. What day are we going to do this on? They cast lots. The lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar, which is approximately 11 months away from the huddle time that they've decided this. So Haman's got a little bit of time. So he goes to King Xerxes, the Jewish queen's husband, oh, the irony, right? And says, there is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom whose customs are different. It's true, their customs were different. They worshipped the one true God. Everybody else had other gods. From those of all the other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. That's not true. Jeremiah 29:7 says also, seek peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Anyway, he goes on, it is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. Esther 3:8-9. And Haman stood high enough in favor with King Xerxes that the king took off his own signet ring from his finger. He gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "Do with the people as you please." Esther 3:10-11. And so the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various people. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Esther 3:12-13. Notice the similarity to the Lord's orders to Saul, which Saul actually ended up disobeying. Haman the Agagite, the Amalekite, wanted to wipe out his own thistle, eradicate it, leave nothing left, right? Problem was, he picked the Lord's chosen people to eradicate. Big mistake, because God had planted a certain person in a certain position of power for such a time as this. I'm getting ahead of myself. All right. When this order went out, the entire Persian Empire understood with crystal clear clarity that somebody in power hated the Jews. And all the satraps and the governors and the nobles, when they got word that someone in position of power hated the Jews, they had to start considering their own loyalties very carefully. Because if the power was against the Jews, and if they wanted to keep their own positions of power, then they'd better be against the Jews as well. Esther 3:15 says, "Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered." Like, what did the Jews ever do to you, Xerxes, that you issued such a decree? And the puppet master, named Haman, smiles behind the king that he's making dance, and he raises his glass in a toast. But when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. Esther 4:1. It all comes crashing down on Mordecai, who realizes who truly is the puppet master, and he sees exactly what will happen to his people, the Jews, without the Lord's help. So sackcloth and ashes are a sign of bitterest mourning, deepest despair, the deepest, blackest pit into which one can crawl to cry out for help. And that's right where Mordecai goes, into that pit. So, Psalm 40 hit me between the eyes this morning as I read this. "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord." Psalm 40, verses 1-3. The thing about God is that he doesn't just save lukewarmly. I made up that word. Or half-heartedly, or uncaringly. When he saves spectacularly. He sees Moses with his arms worn out from reaching to the skies, and he saves with FLAIR. Joshua cut down the entire Amalekite army that day, as long as Moses' arms were lifted high. God hears the cries of his people. He reaches down into the crib, he hooks his almighty hands beneath the armpits, and he lifts out with all the ease in the world. He pulls us out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and the mire in which we find ourselves embroiled through our own decisions sometimes, other times because of our circumstances that surround us. But he always opens the door when we cry out, "Pick me up, get me out of here." Arms up. He's got you under the armpits. That's what I had for today. I'll see you tomorrow for Esther chapter 4.